afternoon. My name is Maria Cornou, and on behalf of all the team at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, I like to greet everyone and to welcome you to this session. In this webinar, we will learn from three recipients of the 2020 Teacher Scholars Grant on practices, pattern, and space in worship. First, we will listen to Dr. Ron Rinstra from Western Theological Seminary about his project aimed to explore the deep patterns in worship as well as in worship constituent parts. On the second place, Dr. Rhoda Schuller and Dr. Kent Bureson from Concordia University will present their findings of their research on adult catechumenate. And lastly, we will learn from Benjamin Meager from Hope College about his study on how the physical design and layout of a worship space influences the experience and reflects the religious identity of the congregation that worships there. After these three presentations, there will be some time for Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time. Let's welcome our first presenter, Dr. Ron Rinstra.
Thank you, Maria. Let me share my screen. So my project is the composition of a book which has a tentative alliterative title, Gifts of Grace for Pattern Loving 44 Forms Worship Leaders Need to Know. As Maria said in her introduction, the book is a book of essays exploring worship and its constituent parts. The book is intended, the audience is pastors, worship leaders, and even curious congregants. And it's thinking about impact, as we talked about earlier today. It's comprised of short essays. So the essays will be between 1,000 and 1,500 words each, exploring these deep patterns in worship as well as in worship's constituent parts. In an introduction, I'll provide a little bit of an overview for the whole book, and that will argue for the importance of patterns in Christian lives. An anthropological section will rely on ritual theory to identify and articulate the ways that humans follow patterns, especially patterns in time, in order to give their lives meaning and coherence. And then a second section of the introduction, more theological, will rely on Jean-Jacques Van Almen's treatment of both the necessity and limitations of forms in worship. So, for example, I have a number of essays on worship ordo, the charismatic temple model, for example, or the reformed threefold ordo, or the ecumenical fourfold ordo. Structures in Scripture like chiasms, which you find everywhere in Scripture, maybe sometimes finding them where they aren't actually there, or the particular form of a lament psalm. Structures in sermons like Eugene Lowry's narrative structure or Paul Scott Wilson's 4-page model. Structures in prayer like the collect form or the great prayer of thanksgiving in the Trinitarian shape of that, which people often use before coming to the Lord's table for communion. And then patterns in song as well. So the AABA strophic form, for example, of a classic hymn, or the verse, chorus, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, chorus structure of a lot of contemporary worship music. So the book has a couple of distinctive pieces. I'm going to include one graphic. It has a graphic design element. So there's one image per form, intending to sort of depict these structures or these patterns in non-verbal ways. So, for example, this particular image is the image that I'm using for the the fourfold ordo of worship that begins with a gathering, and then the word, and then the table, and then the sending. Here is another structure. This is the illustration for chiasm. So when I look at scripture shapes, this is one of those structures that I'll be looking at. These designs were all done by Joey Novak, who some of you may be aware of for his work on what's called the Minimum Bible. He has a minimalist illustration style. This particular one is of a lament psalm. And this one is Eugene Lowry's 5-part narrative loop. And this one is a collect prayer. And then this one is the AABA strophic hymn form. And then the other distinctive part of this work and the project itself is my desire for it to be written in conversation with pastors from multiple congregational contexts to ensure that it has cross-cultural traction. And so this began when I began last year, just before COVID, when I presented a bunch of this material at a couple of seminaries in Jakarta and in Malang. So this is the class of people that I worked with during my week in Jakarta. And I learned a lot from my friends there. I had intentions to meet with a lot of non-Anglo pastor groups back in the USA, some Black church friends of mine and some Hispanic church friends and Korean church friends, but COVID thwarted those plans altogether because I knew that those conversations were going to be tricky and I wanted to have them in person rather than on Zoom. So, but I found that a lot of my conversation partners were, like me, overwhelmed with all of the changes that the pandemic forced on our churches, and they didn't really have the bandwidth to carry on those conversations. So I'll be doing that in the coming year. So I have much of the material done, but not all of it yet. And I guess one word, why this is important, why study these patterns. And I guess the first thing to note is I'm not doing original research. This is more of a collective kind of a product. And what I'm writing isn't a rule book for the liturgy police, a prescriptive manual for getting things right. It's a hospitable invitation. Here is a sampling of the church's collective wisdom. So learn these patterns so that you might appreciate them better, thereby deepening your own worship life, and so that you might adapt them better for your own purposes in your own contexts. So for example, I mean, people attend worship services for a lot of different reasons. Some out of habit, some to rack up some God points or to tick a box on a list of holy obligation. Still others come to church hoping to get some sort of devotional McNugget from the sermon or get caught up in a rush of a spiritual rush through familiar and beloved music. But there's more to be perceived when we come to worship. And it's like, I liken it to attending a classical music, before you go to a classical music concert, you attend a lecture where someone who's knowledgeable about it kind of explains to you what's going on and says, listen for this theme, it's going to return in the fourth movement. And when you become familiar with the structure of the piece, with its melodic themes and moods and meanings, you can listen better and love it more deeply. And my hope is that these essays will help readers have a more significant experience of God in worship through an enhanced awareness of worship structures. And then as far as adaptation, it's commonly accepted in the circles in which I travel that artistic accomplishment begins by understanding and imitating received musical forms and various instantiations of them. In a similar way, liturgy is a synthetic artistic medium. It involves music and language and drama and movement, architecture and ritual and more, and the best practitioners are familiar with received forms as well as superlative examples of those forms. And my hope, bottom line, is that this book encourages folks who help to plan and lead worship or hope to do so at some point in the future to experiment with how some of these patterns might be fittingly adapted to their own communities. I think the church is changing rapidly, and I don't know what worship is going to look like 20 years from now, especially after COVID. But the most faithful worship seems to me won't be innovation for its own sake, but rooted in traditions and patterns that God has blessed the church with for centuries. I've spent some time returning to the Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture, one of those 10 CICW convictions that Michael Hahn shared with us. And that statement doesn't name these sorts of patterns that I'm describing as transcultural, but I am wondering if they have resonance with folk from other cultures. And my experience in Indonesia and visiting some other churches in South Korea, for example, was informative. And one thing I've learned is that many of the forms I've identified in song and prayer and sermon and ordo, they're in wide use in churches in Southeast Asia. Few are able to identify or name those structures as they're being used, but they are using them. And this is, as I hoped it would be, and a confirmation that the work I'm doing on this project might be worthwhile and isn't entirely bound to Western Anglo contexts. But the problem is that so much of Indonesian Christianity is still a result of colonial mission work. The seminarians that I met and the pastors that I met, all of whom I connected with via email, I mean, they understand the worship wars that plagued North American Christianity in the recent past. They're experiencing them right now themselves. And for many of these congregations, their spiritual heart languages are songs, mostly 19th century English hymns that the missionaries brought with them long ago. They love Reginald Heber and Charles Wesley and Fanny Crosby and so forth. But many other congregations much prefer the contemporary, charismatic influence, popular worship songs of Hillsong and Bethel and others like them. I have not fielded so many questions about the fittingness of this song or that song for a very long time. And when I asked them about indigenous music, music written not in English but in Bahasa Indonesia, music that reflects their own culture, they said, in effect, there is no such thing. And one student was quite blunt about it. He said, Bahasa Indonesia is a poor language to write music in. The consonants are harsh, so it doesn't sing well. It has far fewer words than English, so it's not as expressive. And I responded to him in class that the features you were describing of the language, that wasn't that's not a bug. Those were features of the language, and that Indonesian Christians knew the gospel every bit as well as Western Christians, and that the church needed their musical contributions more than consumer juggernauts in the West needed Indonesian royalty dollars. So I was gratified when that student brought to class on the last day a new composition, a setting of the Apostles' Creed, and we all sang it together. And I don't know that my music is working, but I'm going to see if it is. All right, that's good for now. Um, there we go. Um, So, finally, some of the things that I learned. As I said, the project really wasn't for me to learn all sorts of new things. It's sort of a collection of inherited wisdom tested by some cross cultural conversations. But I did learn a few things. And one thing with regard to music is that it's been fairly easy to look at the wide world of Christian prayer or the profusion of homiletical styles that emerged in the last century and to clearly identify patterns. It is much more difficult to do that with music because of all the many elements that go into music: lyric design and melodic shape and harmonic progression and song structure and so forth. And they don't always mix in the same ways with each other. So it creates a more complicated stew. Um, and then the other thing that I learned that I'm sure many others of you have also learned has to do with time management during the pandemic. I was super productive right away. And then as the months wore on, I became less and less so. I really realized I had to grieve some elements of my life that were absent during the lockdowns. Um, those elements are things that give me fuel to do the more solitary process of writing. And without that fuel, the writing suffered. So I'm trying to give myself grace for not being further along on project while enjoying the increased energy I have for it now in the summer. Uh, Finally, the product that I think will emerge from this, there's going to be a book, and I'm working with Fortress Press to make it happen. And then I imagine there will be some adjacent sharing of the learning. I'll teach a course at Western Theological Seminary. I may produce a series of podcasts, and I don't know, maybe speaking engagements. I never know whether those things will happen or not. So that's my presentation.
Can you all see the screen? Yes, thank you. The three tasks of our first Worshiping Community grant, for which Kent was the recipient, were first to study how adult catechumenate practices, particularly practices of faith formation and ritual practices, had successfully discipled adults in 4 Lutheran congregations. We called these our model congregations. Our second task was to serve as consultants to pastors of 4 what we called mentored congregations who were interested in implementing an adult catechumenate. And finally, we hoped to share the results of the project through publications and conference presentations. Realizing that we had a wealth of data documenting congregational transformation through adult faith formation, I applied for and received the Teacher Scholar Grant. We proposed these goals to share our research more broadly with the church. First, to offer affordable workshops on adult faith formation for pastors, other church professionals, and interested laity. We knew that involving the parish pastors from the original congregations as leaders for the workshops would be vital, and we had written the grant with their participation in mind. And we planned to do deep analysis of the data from the interviews conducted in the first grant. This analysis would both shape the structure and content of the workshops and provide the basis for publication of our findings. Of course, everything changed in mid-March 2020. And just as the first grant check arrived, Concordia University ended face-to-face classes, sent residential students home, and shifted all classes to online delivery. It was only after the end of this challenging semester for professors and students alike in mid-May that Kent and I were able to meet virtually with the 4 pastor practitioners to reimagine the grant. The collective wisdom and leadership of these 4 pastor collaborators would make our virtual grant conferences a success. By August, we had our ducks in a row for the first online conference and launched our elegant website, Forming Lutherans, to publicize the conference and accept registrations.
Over our grant work, we have conducted 3 virtual conferences. Treasures Old and New, an introduction to faith formation, offered twice, and Orbiting Christ, a follow-up conference exploring in detail catechumenal dynamics and practices. We learned that with free virtual conferences, participants don't have any skin in the game. As one said, it's very easy to let other things get in the way when it's a virtual conference. Without a financial obligation, it is easy to let participation slide. Thus, the discrepancy between those who registered and those who actually participated. Yet the tangible numbers and feedback indicate that we were able to accomplish our goals. As a respondent said in October, it was uplifting to see how God's Spirit is alive and well in some of our congregations. All of the models provided food for thought on how to adapt in any given congregation. And one of our January participants encouraged our ongoing work. Please offer more opportunities like this to help us better understand and implement the catechumenate. We are also able to measure the impact of the workshops through more intangible measures. We benefited from the shared wisdom of the pastors and collaborators. They provided invaluable insights into faith formation and how it transforms ecclesial life. In addition, mutual support, encouragement, and collegiality was in evidence among conference collaborators and participants. As one said, the mutual respect that the presenters displayed was heartening. Hearing the perspectives of pastors of churches located in different geographical locations helped participants realize that parts of what these churches have done might be applicable to their own churches. From that mutuality of growth and learning, we realized that a best path forward for developing faith formation practices in congregations is mentorship. Mentorship allows modeling toward the specific situations of congregations exploring faith formation. As one participant concluded, I really appreciated the pastor's openness about their own growth in the process. Their openness helped to show how difficult and slow the transition is, but how undeniably worthwhile and necessary it is as well.
We had written into our Teacher Scholar Grant that to plan effective workshops and to further our publishing goals, thorough analysis of our interview data would be essential. Data from the first grant that we'd had little time to study in depth. In the Teacher Scholar Grant, we described our methodology using grounded theory and content analysis, which I had some knowledge of through my dissertation work. But the field has evolved, so I embarked on a pandemic summer of reading about and practicing grounded theory methods. A colleague at Concordia University, Dr. Laura Wagnes-Williamson, professor of education, served as a consultant for me. I developed a process illustrated on the PowerPoint slide. After arranging the interview notes into outline form, then highlighting key phrases from the interview, I would make handwritten interpretive notes. As I learned the process and received affirmation of my results from Laura, I trained Kent. We discovered that this data analysis requires not only time, but deep immersion in and reflection on the interview notes before the culminating stage of memo writing. Our final memos are arranged by themes and open with a key quote from the interviewee that connects with a scripture passage, illustrated here in the example of Dela. She said of her catechumenal sponsors, they kind of took the road with me. That statement, that living voice of Dela, not only captured the essence of her faith formation experience, but also echoes the post-resurrection narrative of Jesus with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Like those first century disciples, Dela, a cradle Lutheran in her 80s, discovered Jesus walking with her on a journey that was steeped in reflection on Sunday gospel readings. And Jesus was revealed anew to her in the breaking of the bread, the Lord's Supper. Our reading of scholars on faith formation shaped the structure of our June conference titled Orbiting Christ, Belonging, Believing, Behaving. Yet we also discovered these three themes during the memo writing process. We each wrote vignettes from selected interviews that traced an individual's path to belonging, believing, or behaving as experienced through the faith formation process. To start each day of our June conference, we read these narratives before passing the leadership of the presentation to our pastor practitioners. Kent will give us an abbreviated example.
Belonging, believing, and behaving reflect a common life as seen in the catechumen's witness. Mark, at Redeemer Evangelical Lutheran Church, entering into his baptism at the Easter Vigil, had no expectations, but he wasn't prepared for the entirely new feelings that he would experience. The rituals were like jumping out of an airplane. Even in his fear about what was going to happen, he knew that there was a parachute deploying. As he said, I turned around and look, who's here? Surrounding him was the entire body of Christ. Faith formation creates belonging. In the midst of the water, more than he expected, pouring over him, he felt cleansed. A burden had been lifted. He became a new person, a personal victory which he shared with all the baptized. So Mark could say, now I understand why I am washed in the water. Liturgy sustains a common life, leading new disciples to belong to Redeemer's life together. In both of our grants, we have focused our efforts on congregations within our denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. While we seek opportunities for ecumenical engagement, we gently have to lead many in the LCMS into ecumenical resourcing. Thus, we will continue to focus our catechumenal efforts on resourcing our denomination and encouraging ecumenical engagement where possible. Central to that task is our website, forminglutherans.org, which we intend to maintain and enhance. We will continue to blog weekly about faith formation, including current reading observations and highlights about available resources. We intend to create, compile, and suggest resources useful for faith formation. We envision providing a network of resources from congregations engaged in faith formation and the development of new resources, especially ritual resources, both by us and consulting pastors within the denomination.
One of our goals for this grant is to publish our research findings, and we're pleased to share the following. We've authored an article on our research from the first grant that has been accepted by Worship, a Roman Catholic peer-reviewed journal with an ecumenical audience. It will be published in the latter half of 2022. I will be writing a Festschrift article on the ELCA congregation we studied. That manuscript is due in August for publication in the journal Currents in Theology and Mission, managed by the faculty of Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa, a seminary of the ELCA. And we envision a book project based on our study of the 4 model congregations. We look forward to answering your questions about our research following Ben's presentation. And we give thanks to God for the support of everyone at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship.
Everyone, hopefully you can see my screen here. Thanks for being here and for listening to our talks. My name is Ben Maher, and I'm an environmental psychologist. So I'm really interested in people's relationship with physical places. And so when I received this grant from the Institute of Christian Worship, my project was always going to be focused on physical worship spaces and how that setting plays a role really in the worship experience. However, like everyone who's spoken so far, the COVID-19 pandemic altered that initial plan, and particularly the schedule for it, simply because people were no longer being allowed to use those spaces for a big chunk of last year. Um, but one thing I quickly started to notice that I thought was really interesting, that a lot of people demanded to physically go to church despite that. And so we all saw a lot of these different stories, and the consequence of those stories of people willing to risk infection to be in these worship spaces. In fact, just on a personal note, my family discovered that my mother-in-law was sneaking into her church during the day last summer just so she could sit in the space that she missed so much. And so, even though I absolutely agreed with, medical recommendations to avoid these types of large gatherings, as a psychologist, I was really interested in this motive of what's driving people to be in those spaces despite the risk that was present there. And what it called to mind for me is a really important concept in psychology known as attachment. This idea that humans just naturally form these really strong emotional bonds with one another, and that having these sorts of attachments to others is really just as fundamental a human need as having food or physical safety. Historically, when psychologists talk about attachment, it's usually in the context of thinking about infants and their parents, or caregivers. The argument being that we as members of the human species, we're born with certain types of just neural programming that increases the likelihood of our being cared for, right? And so that's what we generally call our attachment system. And so if you were interested in observing a toddler, you could identify a few attributes that characterize a child's secure attachment to his or her parent, right? So you see behaviors like these. So they try to maintain close proximity to their parent, they stay close, they experience some degree of distress when they're separated from their parent. The parent functions as a safe haven, right? So if the child experiences something dangerous or scary, they seek out their parent, and they treat a parent as a secure base to explore from, right? So a toddler will crawl off to explore and then return back to mom and then explore some more, return back to mom, and so on. And so the idea is that a child that demonstrates these qualities has what we call a secure attachment to their parent, whereas other children might have an insecure form of attachment where they are either kind of avoidant of their parent and not emotionally attached to them, or excessively so and experience a ton of anxiety in terms of that relationship. What's interesting is that a number of theorists have an interest in thinking about how other types of relationships in our lives show similar types of qualities that can be characterized by this attachment idea. So for example, you can think about someone's attachment to God. Is it secure or insecure? In other words, is this a person that actively tries to be close to God, experiences some distress when God feels distant to them? Do they seek out God specifically as a safe haven during stressful moments in their lives? Or conversely, is God someone that feels unreliable to you or feels distant a lot of the time? That would be telling us it seems to be somewhat insecure. But it's one way of capturing someone's relationship with God. Kind of interestingly, another context where we've used this concept has been in the context of place, right? So people also form emotional bonds to physical locations. So again, I could actively try to stay close and be at certain spaces. I can experience distress when I'm away from certain places for a long time. So for example, with like homesickness is an example. I can seek certain spaces when I feel stressed out. I know I want to go here and that's going to calm me down. Those are all signs of being attached to a certain location. So in my research, one of the things I'm really interested in is the connection between these two different types of attachments. So my relationship with God, but also my relationship with the place that I worship God in. And so in this project, I really sought to explore both of these arrows, right? So looking at how a person's concept of God impacts their experience of the space they worship in, and also how their experience of the place impacts their relationship with God. So this project was quantitative and data driven. So I was able to get the participation of 19 different Reformed churches in the town of Holland, Michigan. So you can see some of them affiliated with the Christian Reformed Church and some of them with the Reformed Church in America. It's a little map here showing you their distribution throughout the town. So this is a place with a high concentration of specifically Reformed churches. My students and I did a couple of things with these churches. For one, we went and visited these worship spaces, and we created floor plans and just sort of models of a number of them. So these are seven examples of them. They kind of look like spaceships from this angle, but they're essentially a bird's eye view of the floor plans, and you can see some diversity in terms of the layout of the spaces that were being used. The idea being that by creating these models, we can start to identify some of these differences and just sort of how they are set up, and try to code for different things that might end up being kind of critical. The other thing we did in these spaces was take a number of different pictures, and you can do some interesting things with images of spaces, just sort of with quantitative analysis, even at the sort of optical level. So for example, you can take pictures and actually quantify things like how visually complex is this space? Is there a lot going on or not so much? How much variability is there in terms of, say, color or brightness? How much do properties of the space simulate what you actually encounter in nature as opposed to being a very artificial feeling place? We're still in the process of working through a lot of this data, so I'm not going to focus too much on these sort of objective features of the space today, although I can answer some questions about them if people are interested. Instead, I'm going to focus a little bit more on our questionnaire, kind of people's subjective experiences of these spaces. So we had individuals who worship in these churches complete a questionnaire. So you can see a little bit of the breakdown of our participants. As you can see, not a ton of diversity in terms of this sample of people, really as a result of the region we're in and also the denominations that we were looking at. But you can see, the average age was about 55, and lots of long-term attendees. The average length they've been at the church was about 20 years. We measured a number of different things. They provided their attitudes about quite a bit, but I want to focus on kind of that key concept I introduced at the beginning of the talk, which is the idea of attachment. And specifically, we had participants indicate the extent to which they agreed with a number of statements designed to measure both their attachment to the physical church, the worship space. And so you can see kind of three statements that are examples of this. So does my church reflect the type of person I am? Do I feel like I miss my church when I'm far away? What's my emotional experience while I'm in this space? To get a sense, you see variability in people's attachment to the space they worship, and also measuring their attachment to God, and specifically insecure attachment. So we're kind of measuring a bad thing, right? So to what extent does God sometimes feel impersonal to me? Does God sometimes feel warm and other times feel cold? So people rating the extent to which they feel these statements are true of themselves as a way of capturing those differences. All right, so as a experimental psychologist, most of what I do professionally is create statistical models. I'm going to spare you a lot of that and those numbers, but I want to give you the basics needed for answering this particular question that I'm kind of interested in. How does my experience of the space impact my relationship with God? And so here, what I wanted to do was test how a number of different things that we measured would predict the extent to which someone felt an insecure attachment to God. And so here are a number of the variables that we measured here. So some of them demographic, like age and gender, how long they've been there. We asked them how much COVID had impacted their regular church attendance over the past year. So some people said extremely, some people said only a little bit. And we also asked them just their satisfaction with certain aspects of worship, like music, the preaching, their social connection there. But most critically, we're interested in their attachment to the worship space. Not all of these things actually predicted their relationship with God, their attachment to God. The things that did seem to matter was age. So people who were older tended to have a more secure attachment to God. Um, Impact of COVID. So the more people said their church attendance had been impacted by the pandemic, the less securely attached they felt to God at the end of that time. But then also their attachment to the worship space. So the more attached I felt to church, my physical church, the less insecurely attached I felt to God. And one thing that I thought was really interesting here is that if you look at just sort of my satisfaction with all the things that we associate with church, music, preaching, friendships, those things did not predict my attachment to God, my secure attachment to God, that it was less about really my cognitive appraisal of I like this and I like that. It was really about my emotional bond to the space that seemed to be making me feel closer. I want to show you one other kind of interesting thing, this little graph here that I'll try to explain. So here on our y-axis here, we're measuring how insecurely attached they are to God. So the higher the number, kind of the worse off their relationship is. And on the x-axis here, we have how much they said COVID had impacted their church attendance. And so there's two lines on this chart. So one of them is dotted and one is solid. And so the dotted line is people who are not really attached to their physical worship space. The solid line is people that are attached to the worship space. And so what you can see, if we look at people who are not really attached to their church, the more they said that COVID had impacted their religious practice during that time, the more insecurely attached they were to God, right? So the COVID had a negative impact on their relationship with God. But people who were securely attached to their church, this line just stays solid. Like it didn't seem to matter. It basically provided a buffer to them from that stress of the pandemic. I think so. So I want to, just sort of finish up with just a few kind of questions here or thoughts. So, first, I just want to highlight the need for us to think about the spiritual elements of physical spaces during worship. And a lot of the, community grants have done a great job of speaking to this. But, if you look at the book of Exodus, right, it devotes 5 chapters to describing what the tabernacle should look like. And, these prescriptions aren't arbitrary. They're meant to communicate particular theological ideas about God and God's relationship with his chosen people, right? And so, I think it's worth us thinking about how best to match these spaces with the concept of God we as a church want to be communicating and reinforcing. But the really important thing I want to get across here is that the design needs to entail more than just symbolism, right? We want to recognize that people's relationship with God is reflected in their relationship with the place. And based off of this research that I've been working on, it seems like creating an environment that people are attached to, that they want to be in, that they have an emotional bond to, that it actually impacts their motivation, connection to God himself, which is, I think, an important idea. I want to end there and just sort of thank these 2 people, in particular, Courtney Peckins and Marcely Kehoe, who are colleagues of mine at Hope College, Courtney in engineering and Marcely in art history, who consulted on this project. And also these 4 students of mine, Esther, Kat, Gabe, and Dan, who did a ton of work traveling to the different churches and making these models and collecting our data. For that, I'll say thank you and happy to answer any questions people might have.
Thank you very much. I will ask all the presenters to turn on your cameras. Thank you, fascinating. And we will have some time for Q&A. We have already some questions, and please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A section. And we will also have a conversation. So please also, panelists, feel free to ask questions to each other and to start this or to continue this wonderful conversation about all these elements, this research that have in common the perspective of formation in worship and through worship. So, Ron, there is one question for you in the Q&A, and there is one question for Benjamin.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for the question, Julie. The first part of your question, which is what worldwide conferences have I found to address these questions? I don't know that I've been to a conference or know of any where the issues of structure are sort of front and center. I imagine that there have been conferences where there might be someone looking at some of these sorts of things, but certainly no whole conference devoted to it that I know of. And then your second question has to do with did funding for the project involve cross-cultural travel? And yes, some part of my grant went to fund my travel in not Milan, Malaysia and Indonesia and South Korea were the three countries that I went to in East Asia.
Thank you. And the other question is for Ben.
Yeah, so the question is about, the challenges of sharing a building with another congregation, right? And obviously that's going to limit ownership to some extent. Yeah, I mean, I think there are multiple ways in which we form attachments to things. So one of them, I mean, if you think about any space you feel attached to, like your home, some of that is the result of just the amount of time you spend there. Some of it is decorating it and personalizing it and things like that. But probably the biggest thing we associate with places we're attached to is whether they elicit positive memories, right? So if you think about engagement with a space and finding ways to get people to be in that space and seeing it as an open space that is there and reliably accessible to them. And again, you can use the metaphor of a parent and a child, right? Is this a place that I can go to and it's going to be there when I need it? Is it a place that I will view as a safe haven, as literally a sanctuary, right? I think there are creative things that you can do to get people to spend time in that space that is going to elicit those sort of positive emotions that connect with that idea of attachment.
Thank you.
Maria, there was a question that Julie put in, and she asked about our website, and I don't know if she saw the answer, but it's forminglutherans.org. It's easier to spell than catechumenate. And she asked, are we doing materials for other church? Everyone is welcome to look at it. We put the word Lutheran in there just because we're both Lutheran and our focus for this grant was on our own denomination. But we are very open to other people using our stuff, and we will be sharing across denominational things.
Great.
I see that there's another follow-up from Julie about my research and Ben's research. And there are congregations I know that quite explicitly place the liturgical furniture in their sanctuary in such a way as to highlight the fact that when we're around the pulpit, this is our listening to the word. We come to the table next, and then the font is used for any number of different purposes. It might be used for a sort of penitential sequence. It might be the place from which the prayers of the people are offered. But there are congregations that quite explicitly use those pieces of liturgical furniture in order to signal moves in the liturgical ordo. So I don't know how that intersects precisely with the sort of attachment research that Ben is doing, but it certainly, I considered thinking about the patterns and structures of buildings and church buildings and ended up going, there's too much there for me to to try to handle. I'm just gonna start here. Maybe that's a follow-up.
Yeah,
And also fascinating to consider this in how it works in different cultures.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think it's interesting to, I mean, certainly thinking about the functionality of a space, certain, what you see with like the Reformed Church, right? There are very often some criticism of the design of spaces that are just sort of relying on kind of tradition. This is what we think a church looks like, right? That, you know, having the altar be front and center makes sense for, say, a Catholic church or, you know, Episcopal church, right? But for a, you know, denomination that really emphasizes the sermon, maybe the pulpit should be more centered, right? And as sort of, right, and sort of thinking about that, or even, you know, denominations vary in the liturgy. Is there a procession, right? If you have a very long rectangular church, that's great for emphasizing procession or bringing the gospel out into the people. If you have a sort of huge auditorium or sort of a horizontal church, right, it kind of ruins that process to some extent. So there are things you can kind of think about in terms of, again, the fit between, you know, what you're trying to communicate and space itself.
One of the terms that I use when I think about this is just a fancy made up theophanic expectation. Like, where do we expect God to show up? And how does the architecture either support or undermine what we say we believe about where we expect God to show up? And for example, the absence of liturgical furniture in some congregations, and the very visible presence, for example, of monitor speakers and stands and cords and mics and amps and all of those other things, suggest simply with their physical presence there that it's the music rather than pulpit, font, or table where we where we rest most of our expectations for where and how God will show up. And there are 100 variations of that. You go to a church and there's the dominant thing that you see is the pipe organ. There too, that communicates something of where we expect God to show up.
I want to just comment on what you said earlier, Ron, about where we do things within the liturgical space. Also, says, sorry, I'm not very eloquent here, but says, where are we experiencing the presence of God now? And I was sitting with a young boy who, oh, maybe he was 8. No, he was younger than that. And he realized as the table was being set, while the offering was gathered, he turned to me and said, pretty soon we get to go up there and I get a blessing. He, at a very young age, understood the ritual movement that was part of our service.
Lovely.
Ben, there is a question for you from Bill Johnston asking about nostalgia. If there is something as a nostalgia scale, neutral sense of nostalgia, with different persons at different places along that scale, and how much might that factor relate to a person's attachment to their worship space as much or more so than features of the worship space? And he explains, if not nostalgia, then just the kinds of experiences and memories a person associates with the space.
Yeah, nostalgia is an interesting it's funny. Yeah, nostalgia is an interesting term because it's understanding as a good or a bad thing has varied historically. My wife is a Victorianist, and she's written about how nostalgia was an illness for a good, a century or so ago, was a terrible thing. Now we have nostalgia is generally seen culturally sort of more positively. But yeah, I mean, I think there's variability, right, in the sense that certainly when we have these long-term attendees at particular congregations, right, that it just makes sense that they're going to be attached to something that they've spent decades at, right, unless there's something traumatic that happens. Whereas for others, reminders you know, individuals who sort of move from low church to high church, right? You sort of have negative reactions to maybe the faith that you were raised in if you are kind of moving in the opposite direction. But I think if you're trying to look at kind of the community level and sort of build that sense of attachment, I think it totally makes sense to have reminders in the space of previous events that have taken place there, right? I mean, I think certainly maybe not in the sanctuary itself, but plenty of churches have a sort of meeting area with pictures from, you know, missions trips and, you know, quilts from various sort of events, right? And I think those things are definitely going to, again, kind of elicit those positive emotions that I have a history here. And particularly, you know, we have a history here. Because, yeah, I think, you know, emphasizing the physical environment, maybe in isolation from the social one, doesn't make a ton of sense, because, you know, they're so intertwined that this is a space for us. It's not my church exactly, like it's not the same as walking to my bedroom, right? That it's a shared environment. And so I think anything that can be done to sort of boost that sense of collective identity, that this is our space, is again, going to bind people. I mean, the main thing I would say to take away, right, when you think about just sort of the psychology of things, is that people form associations, and my relationship with my church body and my relationship with the church, physical church, and my relationship with God are not as independently segregated as we might think. That they're emotionally bound to one another. And so thinking about ways of improving people's relationship with others and relationship with the space is going to help them in terms of their spiritual growth.
I will ask you a final question to conclude. And this is, if you can summarize in a minute, in which sense or how your research could benefit project directors from worshiping communities in this session.
I guess a little silencer. Anyone that's doing work on faith formation or the impact of ritual on drawing and discipling people, you can contact us through forminglutherans.org. We'd love to talk with you.
Yeah, as I said, our data is still in process. So, but we will be, like I said, we have 19 churches that we worked with that we'll be sort of speaking with and sort of sharing our results with. Again, I think in terms of as a quantitative study, a lot of this is trying to provide, you know, empirical evidence of what seems to help people. And so my hope is that the results highlight the importance of thinking about the space and attending to people's relationships and just sort of their embodiedness of us in the physical world.
And I'm sure, because we have always many grants about arts, visual arts in church, that all people, especially working on that aspect, will benefit from your research. Thank you very much, Ben. And Ron.
Can you sharpen the question just a little bit?
Well, how our worship communities, project directors, what can they learn from your research, or something that you have learned throughout your research that can be a good advice, a good tip for those, especially those who are starting the new projects?
Well, with regard to the specific research that I've been doing, when the book comes out, people can read the book. And, you know, like I say, I may end up doing some podcasts. A friend of mine suggested that would be that might be a healthy way to. I mean, everybody's doing a podcast these days, so maybe I'll jump on that train. As far as what I learned, I probably could have done a better job anticipating what research needed to happen when before I began writing, which is to say, I did a lot of research before I began writing. And as I look back on it now, I wished I had just begun writing right away, even with what I already had in my head, rather than thinking that I had to go deeper and deeper and deeper, because I ended up going, yeah, I could now write 20,000 words on this whole thing that I probably could have written the 1,000 words that I needed to right out of the gate. So I'm smarter maybe, but but the project pace was slower. So especially if your project involves some writing, I'll encourage you to just start.
Well, great advice, because we have also teacher scholars participating in this session. And of course, your publications, all the resources website, I'm sure will benefit not only this group of grantees, but also the church in general. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to all participants. And may God continue blessing your ministries, your service, and your congregations. Thank you.
Ben?
Yep.
Everyone else can leave. I just have something I want to talk to Ben about. I wanted to point out to you, Ben, the thing behind me here. This is from my own chapel at Western Theological Seminary. So I put it up today because it's called the Tree of Life, right? There's one on either side of the river. So part of it is reflecting my own attachment to my own space. And that was the scripture that we heard this morning. But you'll also, if you look behind it, you'll see actually that the city of God, it's a map of Holland, Michigan.
Yeah.
It's slightly perfected. There's no there's no airport because we'll all fly in heaven. So I took the airport out when the glass was made. Anyways, I thought you'd get a kick out of that, Ben.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, definitely demonstrates attachment to the several scales, the building and also the town itself.
Yeah.
I had a question for Ron. I want to see what the graphic looks like for the praise song.
He hasn't done that one yet.
Oh, okay. I'll have to email you in the future, or I'll have to buy the book.
All right, very good. All right, thank you.